Well, this is from Dave Dynasty, our friend Dave Dynasty.
Ah, he's a historian.
And well, he's hysterical most of the time, but every once in a while they slip him something and calms him down enough where he can have holiday dinners with the family. Well, now I've got, so hold on. Oh, good Lord.
Well, what's happening there?
A giant truck is pulling up.
A giant truck?
A giant truck is pulling up. It has a swoosh on the side of it.
Like Nike?
Yeah, yeah, like one of them tennis shoes. Is that the same thing as the Amazon?
Oh, it's
the Amazonians
Amazon.
are here all the time.
I guess the Amazonians are there again.
Well, anyway, Dave Dynasty is not from the Amazon. He's from up in Indiana. And he's trying to make sense of the history of Dick the Bruiser's WWA, the World Wrestling Alliance that existed, as we've talked about many times, back in the glory days. And he wrote an email. Would you like to hear his question?
Yes. I'd like to hear anything other than everything I'm hearing now.
Well, I was just trying to bring you into the conversation. I don't want people to think I'm steamrollering you. You're sitting over there muting your microphone, hoping this will all go away.
A steamroller's less noisy.
But anyway, Dave Dynasty says, Corny, in the fall, winter of 1982, Memphis and Dick the Bruiser's WWA worked together. This was shortly after you started managing. Was there ever talk of having you work the WWA shows? What are your memories of this brief collaboration? Dave, there was not only talk, there was action. Brian, do you know where I spent Thanksgiving night of 1982?
Indianapolis.
At the Tyndall Armory in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they didn't have Black Friday then, but it was a dark day for me. The Friday after Thanksgiving, I was in Fort Wayne, as the Dream Machine said, Fort Wayne, ain't nothing plain about Fort Wayne. We've talked about the Bruisers promotion in Indiana and the war with the Sheik in Michigan, and much about how that's all played out. And there's going to be an episode of, hopefully I'm not spilling any beans, Dark Side of the Ring on the upcoming new season that talks about part of that promotional war equation. And but at the same time, we've mentioned, well, and then the territory aged out and they went out of business. But we haven't spent a lot of time on the decline as we have on the glory years in Indy, Brian. So I was definitely part of the decline. As we all know from our previous programs, Indianapolis was in the late 1950s, early 60s, part of the hotbed Midwest promotion, the juggernaut that Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle had put together. Indianapolis was drawing 10 or 12,000 people for the big shows. Cincinnati Gardens, 10,000 people. Detroit was good. Fucking, all over the Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, West Virginia, and ancillary parts of Kentucky. They were doing great business, right? And then when Barnett went to Australia, Bruiser got Indiana, and the second half of the 60s, Bruiser more or less, you look at the cards, it was a smaller time operation. They didn't have access to the world-class talent that Barnett had brought in for this giant territory just for the state of Indiana. So Bruiser was still making shots all over the country anyway. He was a big star, and he ran it more kind of like his hometown thing. And they didn't really run a full schedule as relates to the other territories. Would you say that's a fair assessment? Oh, great one.
Yes, and again, at the peak of Indianapolis under Bruiser, he also owned a piece of Chicago, so that was another priority.
Well, yeah, but at this time when he began and just had Indiana, he could go to Chicago if he wanted, but there wasn't really all these alliances yet put together. So the latter half of the 60s, It was more of a local promotion. Indianapolis wasn't a big money town necessarily. That's where Louisville and Evansville, Indiana went dark, and Lexington, Kentucky, because they weren't doing business. They couldn't keep a steady TV. But then in go ahead.
I was going to say, and maybe this is what you were going to say too. Didn't Bruiser demand money from Jarrett when he started up Louisville because he said he still owned it?
Well, we ain't got there yet. And see, that's the thing. A lot of things started happening. In 1970, Bruiser brought Sam Mineker in, not only to be the TV announcer, but to be the booker. And he started, it seems like as you go back in retrospect and look at the cards and then look at the way things progressed, he started putting more money, such as it was at the time, into the territory at home. And for the day, Mineker was both a good announcer and a good booker. And they started getting better talent, and they started ramping up because they were going to go and invade. In 71, they were going to go into Detroit and try to take that. So with all of that, and that's about the time I started seeing this program progress, they boosted the Indianapolis business. But I think in retrospect, they were probably pissed because Jarrett beat them to it. Because at the same time, Evansville had been dark for the last half of the 60s, and Louisville had been dark for almost 5 years in 1970. And right as Bruiser is ramping up in Indianapolis, and he's going north to expand against Sheik, he probably thought with a bigger crew and better talent, if he could I'll go down and we'll get TV down there. And we'll open those towns back up. And Jarrett beat him to it. But so anyway, from a variety of perspectives, there was controversy over Louisville and this whole expansion up here with Evansville and Lexington along the Interstate 64 corridor. When Jarrett first told Nick that he wanted to try to get TV up here and open up, Nick Goulas didn't think he could make any money at it. And so, yeah, sure, boy, whatever, you get the TV, we'll give you a talent for the booking fee, 10%. But then when Jarrett actually did get TV and actually did open up the towns, and they actually, after a short period of time, started making money, Louisville in particular was doing incredible business. Then all of a sudden, Nick's, boy, those office towns. And all of a sudden, Jarrett had figured if he gave 10% booking fee to the Goulas Welch office, he and his mother were 50% owners in the company. So in effect, they would have 90% of it. Well, then when Nick strong-armed him into being 50-50 owners or 50-50 partners, because it was technically an office town, then he and his mother only had 50% of Louisville Wrestling Enterprises. But then, like you mentioned, Bruiser, when he saw Louisville was doing well and Evansville had opened up and was doing okay for Evansville, he came down one time, him and Snyder, and they were, well, you're running our towns. And Jarrett said, you haven't run them in 5 fucking years, right? But Bruiser called Nick, and because they had the long-time relationship, and Nick kowtowed to it because he would make Bruiser mad. And so they got like 5% of Louisville and Evansville. Lexington was on and off, and I don't think it was part of the deal. Until Jarrett split off from Nick and opened his own company, like 7 years. So all of a sudden, that's what Jarrett said. I thought I had fucking, like 45% of my own company. It turned out I had like 3%.
So what happened after that, though, real quick, without all the noise bothering you too much in the background here?
Don't worry about it. I'm sure we'll be charitable to you this week.
Once the split happens, Goulas still ran Louisville too, didn't he? So did Bruiser?
No.
Oh, he didn't. He stopped right away. So it was just
immediately.
Jarrett. So did Jarrett have a conversation with Bruiser? Did Bruiser show up one day like, hey, I haven't received my money in a while now?
Well, here's what happened. First of all, to answer your question, how Nick did briefly run in when the split happened between Jarrett and Goulas, Jarrett, the Louisville Wrestling Enterprises had always had the contract for Louisville. So that continued seamlessly with the Louisville Gardens, the same building, the television station. That was Jerry and Christine Jarrett's company. And they had signed everything and done everything in their name. It was the exact opposite in Memphis, in that Memphis, the TV contract was Gulas Welch Wrestling. The contract with the Mid-South Coliseum, Gulas Welch Wrestling. Jarrett had been the booker, but he hadn't opened that town. So that's why he had to form his own company, go to Channel 5 and get a new TV. And for the 6 or 7 weeks it took him to just kick the shit out of Nick Gulas' shows, he had to go to the Cook Convention Center. And that was what has, so it was a...
What happened, if you don't mind me interrupting you again, so what happened? Did the contract run out and Nick decided not to continue, or did Nick get out of the contract? Did the Coliseum kick him out because he wasn't producing the... I mean, what happened there between that period of time?
All of those things, because within 6 weeks after the split, when Jarrett took Lawler and all of the wrestlers except for Fargo and Tojo over to the Cook Convention Center and over at Channel 5, Channel 13 didn't want to get involved in this and dropped the TV show and just didn't have wrestling. And Nick was trying to run the Mid-South Coliseum anyway, and that lasted like 6 shows, and he was down to, bringing in the Sheik's talent from Detroit, Crazy Luke Graham and Ripper Collins and the Sheik himself and Abdullah the Butcher and etc. And they got down to like 600 people in the Mid-South Coliseum. And Nick at that point didn't want to keep spending the money, and the Coliseum was like, fuck, if this guy'd get out of the way, we'd have Jerry Jarrett come back. So boom, and there we go. And then April 24, 1977, Jarrett has his first, the split happened like March 20th. And there's 31 days in March, and by April 24th, Jarrett had booked his first show in the Mid-South Coliseum, double main event, Lawler versus Jack Briscoe, Rocky Johnson versus Harley Race, and drew like 9,000 people at jacked up ticket prices. But nevertheless, back to the subject of this. Meanwhile, so Bruiser had still strong-armed a piece of the Louisville operations and that in this area. But then Indianapolis went into its boom period where they were drawing 10 or 12,000 people for the big shows again. And in 1974, we've talked about Bruiser and Sheik drew 16,600 people to Market Square Arena. And that's where Bobby Heenan was in the corner against Sheik and Bruiser's corner against Sheik and Creechman. And Bobby got stiffed on the payoff. He has $600 and he called Vern. But Indianapolis was drawing these big, massive crowds that I would see on Bruiser's TV late at night. And, the Mid-South Coliseum looked great on TV. I hadn't, with 10,000, 12,000 people. I hadn't seen that live either, but I knew going to the Louisville Gardens, yeah, we're getting like 5,000 people, but holy shit, Indianapolis, look at all them fucking people. And it made it look like a big deal when you're a 12-year-old kid, right? And so Indianapolis was cooking. But then, as we've talked about, they settled the war. And Bruiser pulled out of Detroit. And the top talent went away. And Miniker stayed, but it became the, Bruiser's retirement home. I mean, everybody kind of lived there. Pepper Gomez lived there. Snyder moved to Florida and just came back for the Indianapolis shows. And by the end of the 70s, the territory, they said Steve Regal, who was Wilbur Snyder's son-in-law, came down to Memphis in 79 because he wanted to get out. And he started going to Georgia and the Carolinas, places like that, because he was a real talent. And he was the only time they ever had anybody young come into the Indianapolis territory was when it was either Mike Snyder, Wilbur's son for a little while, or Spike Huber, Bruiser's son-in-law, Steve Regal, the winner of the bunch, Wilbur's son-in-law, everybody else was still fucking Yukon Moose Cholak. They were 50-something years old, right? So, same thing with the Sheik by 1980, in that he was out of the Cobo Arena and he pretty much had lost his promotion, which led to Barnett being able to open up in the early 80s off the Georgia cable and etc. By the fall and winter of 1982, Bruiser was not able to run the Expo Center anymore. I don't know what they were doing for television at that point, to be honest. As I recall, Miniker had even moved. He'd gone back to El Paso. And I know that Dave McClain did some TV for Bruiser for a while, but point being, he was on the verge of closing up. And some way or another, he and Jerry Jarrett got started talking because, and you asked earlier, that's what I couldn't remember. When Jarrett stopped paying him, he did start booking him. Because in 77, 78, 79, you would see Bruiser in Louisville every once in a while. You'd see Bruiser in Memphis, had several matches against Lawler, when Lawler was a heel especially. And he would book some of his guys. And of course, he'd worked with him on Jimmy Valiant. Jimmy Valiant, ended up being one of the top stars in Memphis of that glory period. And he got him because he was working in Indianapolis for Bruiser and it was close. So he cut him off on a regular check, but there was still a relationship. And as I mentioned, Steve Regal had come down. Well, then in 1982, you might remember in the summertime, Steve Regal and Spike Huber as a team show up. And they also show up as the WWA World Tag Team Champions. Remember those fancy, the Southern Tag Team title belts looked like shit. They come in with these big fancy belts. That looked like something, right? And that's because Bruiser knew Snyder had already retired, gone to Florida. And Bruiser knew that, well, here's our son-in-laws and we ain't gonna be able to book them. So he was trying to get them work and they were a good team. But the point is, at that period of time, Jarrett started talking to Bruiser and there was a short-lived agreement that Indianapolis would become part of the Memphis territory. And I don't know if that actually, have we told that story or has that been brought up? Because it was so short a period of time, but at one point, Indianapolis was going to be part of the Memphis territory.
We may have brought it up a while back because I remember talking about it, but it's certainly been a good while. We have new listeners.
Well, and also when we have new leaf blowers.
Hey, you mentioned Spike Huber. Is your father-in-law getting fed up with you the quickest way out of wrestling? Because it seems like everyone hangs around wrestling, unless you're like John Ringley, unless you're like Spike Huber, unless like you've really pissed off your fucking father-in-law or the family.
Yeah, with Ringley, it was the brother-in-law.
It was the family, yeah.
Yeah, it was the family. Because the father didn't ever find out about it. He was gone.
The in-laws, I guess I should say.
Yeah, poor Spike didn't laugh, but Steve Regal went on to prosper in the AWA and Crockett and etc.
He got along with his father-in-law.
And Wilbur, what a class guy, right? Nevertheless,
classic Midwest wrestler name, Wilbur Snyder.
From Woodland Hills, California. You see, he was even very suburban. That sounded like an exotic place when I was 12. But what I'm trying to say is that I believe, and maybe Dave Dynasty's research, because I know he's too young to have firsthand knowledge probably, but I'm pretty sure that Jarrett sent the Memphis tape up there. He was sending it. We were doing promos. I don't know what Bruiser was playing up there. But see, Indianapolis had a situation ever since Bruiser really had owned it a few years afterwards, where the big every 3-week event at the Expo Center or the big building, they do the TV underneath and have the guys, even the stars, work twice, do job matches. And then the main events wouldn't be on television or the finish wouldn't be on TV. And then they did interviews. And that's why they did their TV show. In the 50s and 60s, the building was the Fairgrounds Coliseum, and that held 12,000. And Barnett had run that, and Bob Ellis and Bruiser was the big sellout, and blah, blah, blah. And then when Bruiser first opened up, he was running for his house shows, a place called the North Side Armory. That was, as you would imagine it, one of those old armories that seated several thousand people. And he'd have a big show at the Coliseum. And then as he got more entrenched, they moved to the air-conditioned expo center, as they called it, to differentiate from the Coliseum where you're sweating your balls off. And that was, like I've described it, the big Miami Beach Convention Center setup where it was a giant convention hall with movable bleachers that seated thousands. So you could put 8,000 or 10,000 people in the expo center. And this was long before Market Square Arena became the big arena, the NBA building in town. So anyway, Bruiser, the way that they did television, if he didn't have expo center shows, he was off TV, right? So Jarrett started sending the Memphis tape up, and that was the fall of '82. They were just building to the start of the Fabulous Ones. I was just starting with stuff we've talked about before. And the first events, Bruiser, apparently it was his idea. Thanksgiving night of 1982, after they'd run the TV like, I don't know, 10 weeks or whatever it was, we had done promos. That's where Dream Machine, who was one of the New York Dolls, Dream Machine and Rick McGraw, who Jimmy Hart had put together and dressed up in the top hats so that the Fabulous Ones could be born when Fargo got pissed. Dream Machine's doing, Fort Wayne, ain't nothing plain about Fort Wayne. Because we're going to Indianapolis at the Tyndall Armory on Thanksgiving night, and in Fort Wayne at the big building, the Memorial Coliseum, the Friday night. And the reason why I'm on the card, I'm with Jesse Barr. I've just got Jesse Barr at that time, remember? And I think we worked with Terry Taylor, and the New York Dolls had Spike Huber and Steve Regal, and they're home for Thanksgiving. And the main event was Kamala was just finishing up in the territory. He had worked all year and had the big angle with Lawler and beaten everybody and been the Southern champion, but he's kind of on the way out. And the main event was Kamala versus Dick the Bruiser. And Brian, think about Bruiser's mobility in 1982 and the fact that he never sold for anybody and never started. And imagine what that match was like. But that was, yeah, and then, a couple other matches with the Memphis guys, because in the real territory, everybody was in Nashville that night. Because then they could either just leave their house at 5:30 and go to the show and be home at 10 o'clock, or, Lawler was probably off, or elsewise he and Jimmy Hart could drive back to Memphis in 3 hours, whatever. But the buttermilk run, as Dream Machine would say, we're up there. And I caught the worst fucking cold. It was so incredibly sick. And it was fucking colder than a witch's tit. Fucking brutally cold weather. And I would say, I mean, this was before I had the status to ask about a house, and I wasn't real good at eyeballing crowds on a financial basis at that point. But if they had more than 500 to 700 people in a Tyndall Armory on Thanksgiving night in Indianapolis, I would be stunned. And when you think about it, here's a whole new group of talent that they've never seen before on this brand new TV show, and plus Dick the Bruiser, Spike, and Steve. But, and then Fort Wayne, the Coliseum up there. Remember, Brian, did I tell you, this might have been before you joined the program, but like almost 10 years ago, I did an appearance at a minor league basketball event where the minor league team in Fort Wayne, Indiana, they'd had a U of L player who was on the team. I was hoping to get to see him in action and everything, and he got called up like 2 weeks beforehand. But it was in the old Coliseum in Fort Wayne where they had the matches for years and years. And this was in 2000 and let's say 15. The record number in the biggest arena in Fort Wayne, Indiana, of people that they ever had in the building was for Dick the Bruiser and Baron von Raschke in 1971. Still to that day. So that's how hot Bruiser had been at one time. And in 1974 at Indianapolis, like I said, 16,600 in Market Square Arena for Bruiser in the main event against the Sheik. 8 years later, Bruiser is main eventing the Tyndall Armory in front of 500 fucking people in the same town. And with the next day we go to Fort Wayne, there couldn't have been 500 hardy souls. And that was the first time that I learned the definition of a piss hole in a snowbank. And I don't think there were any other shows. We may have done promos for some. They may have happened. I wasn't on them, or they may not have even happened, and I wasn't booked on them to begin with. But that was about the end of that. And Bruiser is pretty much the WWA moved over to, as we talked a little bit about recently, moved over to Ohio. And in the mid 80s, Jerry Graham Jr. was involved, and Bruiser was mostly retired. And that's why that the same thing as Detroit. Detroit became, went from being one of the market centers of wrestling in the United States for years to a dormant city in 1980 with no major arena having live wrestling. And Indianapolis, another major market, by 1982, there was no regular local wrestling in any major arena. And that's why Indianapolis took to the WWF expansion so much more quickly than even Louisville's 100 miles from Indianapolis. But it took, they had no local promotion, and they'd been dark for any kind of mainstream activity for 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden they get named stars again.
Do you think that's what you needed to kind of get past Bruiser? Because the company never got past Bruiser's earlier star power, and it never grew past that. It was the next line. Like, Hulk Hogan was a star. The stars of the WWF at that time, the national stars, were presented like that.
Yeah. Well, and also you're going for it for a few years, they didn't have anything, much less stars. I mean, even if the TV show, if they were producing a local television show, if it was on the air in Indianapolis, as somebody ought to research 82 through 85, was there any local TV on in Indianapolis? Could anybody see it? Was it cable access? Was David McClain doing those stand-up interviews for Toledo? I'm just saying, it was such a small presence that when all of a sudden Vince puts his TV on, and they knew some of these names. A lot of those guys had worked for Bruiser in Indianapolis. But here there's big arenas again and people in the stands again. And they're coming to town live again. Holy shit, we've missed this. Boom. In Louisville down the road, it was a harder sell because they had great shows every week.
Has anyone ever actually figured out what statistics, with the actual numbers, whatever we know of the, forget about the gates, really just the attendance in a lot of these cases, you could try to figure out the gate from there, of how much damage it did when Bobby Heenan left? If it did any at all?
Well, yeah, it did do, but see, things...
Did it take time for it to really sit in, or did it happen right away?
Well, it took time because, see, in those days, the way that the business was and the way that Bruiser booked and presented his shows, it was a while before you knew Bobby was gone. Because, if you had a show every 3 weeks and the TVs, a lot of times you'd get 2 weeks of new shows and then a rerun. But the rerun would have the main event featuring some guy that's going to challenge Bruiser at the next Expo Center show live looking good. But people were used to reruns with new interviews in the show. People were used to, I mean, even if Blackjack Mulligan was going to be back, they would show a 3 or 4 year old fucking tape with him on it. So it took a while but slowly through attrition, when the war ended, Bobby left, and People didn't know he wasn't coming back, but they knew he wasn't around. And who's this handsome Johnny Starr guy? He's not as good as Bobby. And then the rest of the talent, 75 wasn't just a disaster, but it wasn't as good as 74, and 76 wasn't as good as 75. And really, the last time, this will show you, though, how over Bruiser was, and just the idea of going to wrestling and watching television, because there still wasn't any other product in Indianapolis. When Bruiser made Guy Mitchell, Stomper Guy Mitchell, for the Sheik in Detroit, and Guy Mitchell was one of the assassins for Bruiser in the mid-60s, and Guy Mitchell and Roger Kirby were a tag team, made Guy Mitchell the Mass Strangler. And he had a red, white, and blue mask on, and they brought him in, and this is either 78 and 79 or 79 and 80. One of those, I think 78, 79. But they gave him a big push. They put the belt on him. He beat Pepper Gomez, for fuck's sake. He beat Wilbur Snyder. He beat everybody, every babyface that was not using a walker that had ever been over in Indianapolis, and beat the Bruiser. And had a long push, and that got over to the point where when they did the blow-off match, and it was all kinds of stipulations. The Strangler, if he loses, he's got to unmask. He's going to lose the WWA World Title. He's got to leave town for a year. If Bruiser loses, he's got to leave town or retire or do something drastic. The people, oh my God. Basically, it was a guarantee. We're finally going to see who this motherfucker is. We're going to take this guy's mask off, and he's going to be gone. And that's the last time Indianapolis drew 10,000 people. And, that was like, if that was 79, if I'm right on that, then it was another 5 or 6 years before Vince even showed up with a major event. But they still that late, because they got interest in that. There were enough people watching TV, and Bruiser's name was strong in it, because I was watching the TV. These matches were fucking rotten. Just horrible. But they got behind, we want to see who this one fucking guy is. We want to see Bruiser unmask him and beat him. But otherwise, it was dreariness.
Like a lot of the people that you look back fondly on now, at the time, were people groaning like, oh, here's Moose Cholak again?
Yes. Because that's the thing. Moose Cholak in 1963 in Chicago, he had a gimmick and the Golden Moose Cholak, whatever the fuck. He was an amateur wrestler. There was something to be had there. But in 1978, he was a guy, living in Chicago, fucking. I heard at one point he had a job driving a bus. He may have owned a tavern. He did commercials with Bob Luce for Al's #1 Chicago Italian beef. Nim, 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 nim. But, I mean, it was... Pepper Gomez had been the hottest babyface in the country in 1962, working with Ray Stevens. But he was challenging for the world title in 1977. He'd been in the business 25 years. That type of thing. It just... Everybody was so old, and they'd been there so long, or they'd seen him so long. They'd come and go and come again. And here's one more thing, and that's why I was thinking about this, and then we may have answered Dave's question. But Bruiser was partners in Chicago with Vern. And who else had a piece of Chicago? Help me out now. I've gone blank.
Wilbur Snyder, right?
Well, Wilbur and Bruiser and Vern and somebody, and Muchnick had a piece, or somebody from the Central States office. Somebody else was involved. Nevertheless, Chicago was about to enter into a boom period because Vern was still cooking in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, and Hulkamania was about to even start. 1983 would be a banner year, record year for the AWA. But Vern didn't expand into Indiana and take Indianapolis, which had a potential to be a market where you could sell 10,000 to 15,000 tickets. Even though they'd been working together in Chicago for 15 or 20 years. And Barnett, who and this was early because we've talked about the reason why that Barnett took the Georgia crew into Ohio and the auxiliary parts of West Virginia, in part was because Ohio, and specifically Columbus, Ohio, was one of the first places to be wired for cable to enough extent that it made a difference, where they were seeing Georgia wrestling in a new area, and Barnett was salivating to get his old territory back. Well, Indianapolis was his old territory. But even he didn't try to get the Georgia tape in there. Well, maybe he couldn't, I don't know. But nobody tried to really take it until, Vince was just did his expansion, and then Crockett. And I think 86, 87, this happened a few times. But they got paid 50 grand for paid shows at the Indianapolis State Fair, and we went and worked the old Fairgrounds Coliseum. I think one of them was for Crockett, and then one of them later on was for WCW. But it was a major wrestling market that was dark to local live events. One of the first cities to go dark of the entire territory wrestling wars and eventual demise. Why would nobody else come and, if not help Bruiser out, take it the fuck away from him?
Well, it's hard to start up, I would imagine, especially if things are really dead.
Yeah, but look at Vern had said, well, goddamn, they got no wrestling in Salt Lake City. I live in Minneapolis. Let's just go open that son of a bitch up. But now he's doing record business in Chicago and Minneapolis, and he doesn't want to get into Indianapolis. The more I think about it, it's odd that Bruiser would be like Jerry Jarrett be the only one. And the Memphis talent was all young guys, and nobody had ever been to fucking Indianapolis and been over. It was complete. It could have taken, Memphis was about to be on a boom period. Maybe it might have gotten over, but it might have taken a lot more time than they wanted to spend. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I always get the knockoffs confused. Was it Gary Lawler? Wasn't there a fake Lawler in Indianapolis?
No, that was much later on.
You know who I'm talking about? I'm not talking about Steve Lawler. I'm talking about a different one.
Yeah, there was a gorgeous Gary Lawler, and he had a goatee and parted his hair on the side and had one single.
And wore the trunks, the same outfit that Lawler wore.
Yeah. But that was on such a low. This was after everything else had already gone to hell and gone out of business. And I think it's primarily the southern part of the state, because Indianapolis TV, Lawler wouldn't mean anything, but Evansville TV, which is on the Indiana-Kentucky border, that's where he came from. But he was not, the jig was already up as far as wrestling being seen on a major local TV show on a widespread audience by the time that he came around. He wouldn't have had anything to do with Indianapolis in 1982. But no, nobody tried to take it. And again, yes, Bruiser and Jarrett had been working together, but one would have thought that since Vern had a laundry, unless there was heat between Bruiser and Vern, if Vern had a laundry list of guys that had drawn major money in Indianapolis working in his territory at that time, Bruiser says, yeah, Jarrett, can you send me a TV? And then Jerry Jarrett always said the reason why that it didn't last and he pulled out of the thing was because it's an oversimplification, but there's something to it. It was the same thing as the Von Erichs. And you want me to run this thing that you've run into the ground, but now you put yourself on the cards back in the main event. Because that night, on Thanksgiving night, he beat Kamala. 6'6", 325 pounds, the Ugandan giant. But he went down to defeat at the hands of Dick the Bruiser, who was closing in on 60 that year. And because the budget for the show was so small, they didn't send a Friday or anybody to handle Kamala's stuff. They told me I'd managed Jesse Barr, like I said, and then Dream said, come out with us and try to help get us some heat, with the Regal and Huber, because there's fucking nobody there. And then they sent me out to take Kamala's ceremonial, headgear and all of his apparatus. And I'm thinking, my God, 8 years ago, I was watching Bruiser in front of 10,000 people in the Expo Center beat the shit out of Bobby Heenan. And now I'm in the ring taking the heels equipment in front of 500 people working with Dick the Bruiser. It was surreal, as the kids say. But that's Jared Pulday's. He didn't want to get off the top if wrestling was going to be run in Indianapolis, even on that low of a level. You can't tell me that most of those people wouldn't have come anyway at that point, right? But that's Bruiser.
Did it hurt Bruiser when he got a perm?
Boy, it sure didn't help. Imagine he wanted to look younger. More hip and with it. He got a curly perm in 1981. What would he have been? He would have been, because he started playing for the Packers in 53, so that means he'd graduated college. So I think he was born in 29. When he was 53 years old, he's got a fucking perm. And Dick the Bruiser with a perm to begin with. It looked like Spike Huber could carry it off. Bruiser didn't. And I think that's when people just started realizing, and the no-selling thing also always worked for him when he was young and looked like Brock Lesnar, and you could believe, well, this guy will fucking kill you and eat your bones. But when he was so old and he just really, you could kind of tell he couldn't move to begin with, and he wasn't selling, then it just looked fake. And it kind of killed the aura. And then in Chicago, with Hawk and Animal slammed him and Crusher. I've told that story, haven't I, or have I?
It's been a while, but yeah.
Well, but in the ultimate clash of generations, Chicago was doing so well in the mid-'80s. It was fucking huge houses. And they had the classic tag team match, the Road Warriors, in like their second year in the business, as the most dominant tag team in wrestling at that point, against Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher, who for 20 years had been the epitome of kick-ass tag team in wrestling. But now both those guys are almost, Crusher may have been 60. Bruiser was close to it. And the Road Warriors didn't know shit from apple butter about who these guys had been or were supposed to be or what they did or didn't do. And they got into a big four-way, and fucking they both went and scooped him up and slammed him. And I talked to Animal. He's like, whichever one said this, because Hawk had one and Animal had the other. But one, either Bruiser or Crusher, said, "What the fuck are you doing?" And the guy said, "Anything we want to do." And Crusher was just, God, it must have been Bruiser. "What the fuck are you doing?" Because then Crusher was just, "What the fuck is going on here?" He was amazed he couldn't speak. And it was a complete clash of styles. But yeah, that's what happened to the territory. And that got me started thinking that was a big major market, that a lot of territories on all sides of it were doing record business in 1981, 82, 83. Memphis, Chicago, Vern, Barnett and the Georgia tours in Ohio and West Virginia, Michigan, and Indianapolis sat there like a turd in a punch bowl. Thank you, Dave Dynasty, for your question. Boy, I tell you, Brian, it's obvious, but it's more true now that we've.
It's very obvious.
Well, it's more true than ever before. Now that we've illustrated it with that little story there, that little moral to the story, that everything dies sooner or later. Everything and everybody. I mean, you can be in the pip, in the chips, you can be full of vim and vigor and piss and vinegar one day, and the next day, poof, you're gone. It's a roll of the dice. It's kismet, is what it is. It's karma. it's kismet, it's all variety of ancient medical mysteries and Chinese secrets. That's what it is. But you got to be prepared. And that's why we all need life insurance. I think, Brian, you can attest to this. A good life insurance policy will help reduce the worry and stress that your family and beneficiaries and close members may have when you're gone. Do you know how much a burial at sea costs these days?
A burial at sea? I have no idea, no.
Well, it's a lot. I thought you'd know exactly. But folks, fortunately, our friends at SelectQuote, one of America's leading insurance brokers, they've got nearly 40 years of experience. They have helped over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. And right there, that shows you that they love the people. They want to help and serve the people. That they would take that amount of risk. $700 billion, can you imagine if all those son of a bitches had died in the same year?
No.
Well, they'd have been on the verge of extinction. But that's because they want to help people at SelectQuote, because other of these life insurance brokers, they offer the impersonal, one-size-fits-all policies that may cost you more and cover you less, like a little baby blanket. It's not covering you. You're still cold at night. You're shivering out in the cold, cruel world. Your little goody bits aren't covered up. Well, SelectQuote's going to wrap you in a security blanket of coverage. Their licensed insurance agents work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs, and they can do it pretty darn quick, too. And have you ever worried, Brian, I know with all the problems that you've had with toenail rot, various forms of whooping belch.
I haven't had any of those problems.
If you've had pre-existing health conditions, worried about getting coverage, because those pre-existing conditions could contribute to poof, and you're gone. Well, SelectQuote partners with carriers that provide policies for a variety of health conditions. Say that nagging case of malaria never quite went away, you still could get coverage. If you got high blood pressure, no problem. Diabetes, that's fine too. Heart disease, they find carriers that can cover those conditions. So if you've got all these things wrong with you, I won't say it's no problem. Sounds like you're in for a variety of problems, but life insurance won't be one of them. And if for some reason you have no problems with your health, such as that is right now, then they work with carriers that can get you same-day coverage with no medical examination required, no more. Will somebody come to your house and do a complete proctological examination on you in your kitchen? That does not happen with SelectQuote, because you can head right now to SelectQuote.com, and a licensed insurance agent. That means somebody's keeping track of this fucking guy. He's got a license. There's a record on him. He can be looked up, so you can trust him with any personal information he may ask. I know that when my guy came over before I found SelectQuote, he was here for 4 or 5 hours getting information on me. Asked me a variety of questions about German videos. But anyway, a licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget, and obviously, the goal is for the end of your life, because that's what's going to happen eventually, and you need to get ready. SelectQuote, they shop and you save. That is your responsibility. All you need to do in this relationship is save money. They'll do all the shopping. So right now, and in the immediate future, you can get the right life insurance for you for less at SelectQuote.com/JCE. SelectQuote.com/JCE. Right now, this very moment, in a panic, you get started right away, SelectQuote.com/JCE. You never know. What, Brian? We've got such a big audience. What are the chances that if somebody is listening to this program right now, they're going to have some kind of stroke, aneurysm, or projectile diarrhea and just just expire before they get to the end of it?
I don't know if we can quantify that. I don't think we should either, but we can tell people to be prepared with Select Quote. One more time, what's that promo code, Jim?
/JCE is the promo code at selectquote.com, but it's all
almost
seriousness.
English. Yeah, all
seriousness. Yes, selectquote.com/JCE. Has anybody ever just up and died while they were listening to our show before? It has to have happened. All the thousands of hours and the millions of listens. What? Why were we not apprised of this? Why hadn't somebody written us and said, you know what? He was listening to your show. He knew something was wrong, and he wanted to get his head right on his way out. Nobody ever said that.
Well, there's no insurance for dying on the air, but Select Quote.
Well, now it depends on if you're not dying on the air. We've died on the air many times. I can chapter and verse you on those, but people who have died while listening to us. And wouldn't it even blow your mind even more if they died while they were listening to us dying on the air?
How do we get out of this? Select Quote.